Today I'm going to be making turkey Swedish meatballs. And again, this is a recipe that I learned to make when I was a young girl. And this was a favorite at our house. And first, I'm going to be slicing 3 large Vidalia onions. And with Swedish meatballs, normally you use ground beef. And again, I'm going to be using ground turkey to make it healthier. And another thing that makes it more healthier than the normal meatball is I choose to bake my meatballs. So you have 2 pluses. You're using ground turkey, and you are also baking the meatballs. And I will be making a white sauce to put over the turkey meatballs, so that when they're baking, they'll have a gravy. And normally people will use meat drippings to make the gravy. Since I'm using ground turkey, I will be using butter, which is not as healthy, but it'll give it a nice flavor to make the gravy that normally goes over Swedish meatballs. And I'll be serving the meatballs with just regular egg noodles, but we are using the wheat noodles. So I'm finished slicing the onions, and I'm getting ready to put the onions in the bowl that I have next to me. And the next step is, at my house, when we made the meatballs, we would use cheddar cheese, and we would place a piece of cheddar cheese in the middle of each meatball, so you had a little surprise when you cut your meatball open. So what I'm going to do is I'm slicing the cheese into approximately 1-inch blocks, and I'll be using this to put in the middle of each meatball. And again, I'm using 2 pounds of ground turkey, and I'm using 2 large eggs, 3 large Vidalia onions. So the cheese has been chopped, and I'm going to pause so I can get my other ingredients together. I'm going to get ground flaxseed, and I'm going to be using the flaxseed to help maintain the meatball itself along with the eggs, and I use the eggs to bind it together. Okay, so I have gathered up my ingredients that I'm going to be using. We've already cut our onion. I'm placing 2 pounds of ground lean turkey in my bowl. And I'm going to be placing a 1/2 cup of ground milled flaxseed. And next I'm going to be placing 2 large eggs into the bowl. Next to my meatballs, I'm getting ready to add approximately 1 tablespoon of garlic. We love garlic at my house. I'm using sea salt. And I'm taking a half a teaspoon, maybe a quarter teaspoon of salt. And about a quarter teaspoon of ground pepper. And again, when you're adding your spice, it's to whatever you're liking, whether you want something strong or something that doesn't have as much flavor to it, so that it's less instead of more. So now what I'm getting ready to do is I'm going to mix the meatballs up, and I'm just going to fold the turkey in with the onions and the eggs and the flaxseed, and then also with my ingredients that I used for the spices, which were salt and pepper and garlic powder. Okay, I'm going to continue to fold in the onions with the ground turkey and the spices. And with my Swedish meatball that I make, I put cheddar cheese in the middle of each meatball, and I also bake it instead of fry or brown it on top of the stove. And for the gravy, I'll be making the gravy with butter and flour and vitamin D milk. Okay, so now it looks like the meatball mixture is ready. So I'm just going to move the bowl back, clean my hands off a little bit, and I'm going to move my pan over so you can see. And I like to make my meatballs palm-sized. And so what I do is I take the cheese and I just push the cheese right down into the middle, and I roll the meat into a ball. And I do this process until all of the meat has been rolled. So I'll do 3 or 4 so you can get the idea. I just push the cheese down in. And again, my meatballs, I only do it to the size of my palm. And I push the cheese through the middle, and I keep rotating the meat to make the little ball. And this will be my last one that I'm videoing, and I'll let you see the pan of meatballs when I am finished. The first step in making the gravy to the Swedish meatballs is I'm cutting butter 1 stick. I'm turning my stovetop on to medium high, and I'm placing the pats of butter into the pan, and I'm moving my camera closer so you can see. And I'm going to be melting the butter. And we are going to be using a shake flour that tends not to be lumpy when you're making gravy. And when the butter melts, I'll be adding salt and pepper to taste, and I'm also going to be adding garlic to the gravy, and that'll give the meatballs added flavor. And I'll be making wheat egg noodles for the Swedish meatballs and the gravy to go over top of. So right now I'm just kind of stirring the butter as it melts. And as you can see, I have a whisk, and I'll be whisking vitamin D milk into the mixture to make the gravy. So it's starting to melt, so I'm adding my salt, and probably a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And I'm adding my ground pepper. This is going to be approximately 1/4 of a teaspoon. And I'm adding garlic to taste. And the next step is I'm going to be whisking my flour into the butter, and I'm constantly going to be stirring the flour and the butter together with the whisk. I'm just doing it in little circles. And it is getting thick, so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to gradually add milk as I'm whisking to the mixture to make the gravy. And you can always add more salt or pepper to taste. It's whatever your preference is. But the key to making gravy is to constantly stir. And I prefer to use a whisk over a slotted spoon. And you're just making small circles. And I start in the middle, and then I move out. And I'm going to gradually add more milk. And you will see this starting to thicken. So you want to keep a little bit of reserves left for your milk, so in case you need to add more milk, you can do so. And this is basically watching and looking for the right consistency as the gravy thickens. And the key to no lumps is to keep stirring constantly. And again, I start in the middle and I work my way out and I go around in a circle. And once the gravy is done, I will be taking the meatballs out of the oven, and I'll be placing the meatballs into a serving dish, and I'll be pouring the gravy over top of the meatballs. So you will be able to see the results of Swedish meatballs with gravy. And the gravy is starting to thicken up. And I'm going to add the rest of the milk. Again, I used 4 cups of milk to 1 stick of butter. And I'm constantly stirring. And that's the key to making gravy without lumps. You have to constantly keep the whisk or a slotted spoon moving at all times so that there's no lumps. And the gravy is just about done. Starting to thicken up nicely. And the thing with gravy is if you make it too soon and you let it sit, there is a film that collects on the top of the gravy itself. So before you serve it, if that happens, just gently take the film off and you can just discard it. Okay, so now I'm getting ready just to turn the gravy on low, so it's done. And there you have gravy for your Swedish meatballs. I just took the meatballs out of the oven and I put them in a serving dish. You can see that the cheese has melted out of the meatball. And this will give the meatball added flavor when you cut into it also. And I'm getting ready to pour the gravy over the meatballs. Okay, I'm slowly pouring the gravy over top of the meatballs. And after I do this, you will be able to see what the meatballs look like with the gravy on top of the egg noodles. Here is the final product of the Swedish meatballs that were made from ground turkey and homemade gravy. And until next time, I hope you enjoy.